Ha-Satan, the original, in the Book of Job, one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible. A figure called Ha-Satan appears in the divine court of God. He is not God's enemy. He is God's auditor. The word ha-ir is the definite article meaning the. Satan means adversary, accuser, or obstacle. The scholarly consensus is that this character is a sort of attorney, with Satan carrying significant legal connotations. In the story of Job, the character is never referred to as Satan, the proper name. He is Ha-Satan, the accuser. He is not a cosmic rebel warring against the Almighty. He is a functionary in the divine council. His job is to audit human righteousness. He is cynical, but he is obedient. He cannot touch a single hair on Job's head without God's express permission. In the beginning, there was no cosmic war. There was just a bureaucracy. In the Hebrew Bible, YHWH's greatest enemies are not fallen angels commanding armies of demons. They are human beings. Other than human beings, HWH has no nemesis, nor are there malevolent spiritual forces not under his authority. It is within this divine court of justice and retribution that Satan has his origins. This is the baseline, the starting point. A heavenly civil servant with a cynical disposition, doing a job that God assigned within a system God controlled. What turned this bureaucrat into the commander of the armies of hell, the adversary of all creation, the red-skinned horned figure of 1,000 nightmares, is one of the most consequential processes of cultural borrowing in human history. It started with a Persian king, Angra Mainyu, the Persian contributio. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and allowed the Jewish exiles to return home. They came back carrying something new. When the Jews were exiled to Babylon in the 6th century BCE, they came under the rule of Cyrus the Great, a Zoroastrian emperor. This period marked a significant transformation in Jewish theology, with Zoroastrian ideas permeating Jewish texts and practices. Satan as an adversary, originally a neutral figure in Jewish thought, Satan evolved into an active opponent of God, reflecting Zoroastrian Angra Mainyu. Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, was co-eternal with Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, not a subordinate, not a creation, a co-equal opposing principle that chose destruction at the primordial moment of existence and had been at war with goodness ever since. In Zoroastrianism, the world is seen as a battleground between two opposing forces, Ahura Mazda, the god of light and wisdom, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness and chaos. Jewish theology before the exile did not contain this idea. There was no cosmic adversary. There was no organized force of evil operating in permanent opposition to God. YHWH controlled everything, including the bad. There was nothing like this in Jewish thought before the captivity, but we see beginnings of such thought soon afterward. And in the New Testament, we find a fully developed personality of Satan as God's opponent, with his own angels. This was a new thing. It did not exist before. The exiles who walked back from Persia brought the architecture of cosmic dualism with them. The divine bureaucrat started acquiring enemy status. The accuser started becoming the adversary. Angra Mainyu gave Ha-Satan the job description he had been missing. Lotan/Leviathan, the Canaanite body. The devil needed a body. The earliest version of Leviathan doesn't appear in the Bible, but in the texts of Israel's Canaanite neighbors at Ugarit. There, Lotan, the Ugaritic form of Leviathan, is described as a terrifying, many-headed serpent. One text records the victory chant of Baal after defeating him. Though you smote Lotan, the wriggling serpent, finished off the writhing serpent, encircler with 7 heads. Lotan seems to have been prefigured by the serpent Temtum, represented in Syrian seals of the 18th to 16th century BCE, and finds a later reflex in the sea monster Leviathan. Lambert went as far as to claim that Isaiah 27:1 is a direct quote lifted from the Ugaritic text. Isaiah 27:1, written roughly in the 8th century BCE. In that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. The Canaanite chaos serpent defeated by Baal became, in Hebrew tradition, the chaos serpent defeated by YHWH. Same monster, different victor, same theological function, the primordial force of disorder that the divine authority must periodically suppress. The shadow of Leviathan is seen again in Revelation 12-13, where a very Leviathan-like creature is described as a devouring dragon, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. By the time of Revelation, the cosmic serpent, the chaos dragon, and the devil had merged into a single entity. Lotan of Ugarit, a Canaanite sea monster from the 14th century BCE, had become one of Satan's forms. The monster was absorbed. Its original owners were forgotten. That is how theological borrowing works. Typhon. The Greek architecture. He had 100 serpent heads, each producing a different animal sound simultaneously. His lower body was a mass of coiling vipers. He was the child of Gaia and Tartarus. The earth's grief mated with the deepest abyss in existence, and he was the last and greatest challenge to Zeus's authority. Typhon lost. Zeus buried him under Mount Etna, which is why the volcano still erupts. But Typhon did not stay buried, not conceptually. Over the course of several centuries of influence from many different cultures, the defeated accuser of the Christians would go on to appropriate aspects of various divine enemies, Typhon, Hades, Ahriman, Hela, among others, to become the complex mythological monster who was thrown out of heaven at the beginning of time to rule the fiery underworld and torment the souls of the damned. The structure of Typhon's story: a powerful being defeated by the chief god, imprisoned in a subterranean space associated with fire and chaos, mapped precisely onto what Christian theology needed for Satan's narrative architecture: a fall, a defeat, an imprisonment, a persistent threat from below. The mythology and iconography of Typhon influenced Jewish and Christian ideas about the struggle between good and evil. Greek philosophy and Greek mythology were the intellectual infrastructure of the early Christian world. The theologians who formalized Christian doctrine in the 2nd through 4th centuries CE were educated in Greek thought. When they needed to describe Satan's nature, his fall, his imprisonment, his eventual defeat, they had Typhon's story ready to hand, even if they never cited it directly. The monster under the mountain became the prince of the underworld. Pan. The face. This is where it gets specific. This is where you can point to an exact creature and say, that is where the image came from. Pan was the Greek god of wilderness, shepherds, and rustic music. He had the upper body of a man and the lower body of a goat, cloven hooves, a tail, horns growing from his head. He played his pipes in mountain forests. He caused sudden irrational terror in travelers. The word panic derives from his name. He was not evil. He was not dangerous. He was beloved by the people who worked with animals and lived close to nature. Much of Satan's traditional iconography in Christianity appears to be derived from Pan, a rustic, goat-legged fertility god in ancient Greek religion. Early Christian writers such as Saint Jerome equated the Greek satyrs and the Roman fauns, whom Pan resembled, with demons. Satan's pitchfork appears to have been adapted from the trident wielded by the Greek god Poseidon. In similar fashion to building over temples to create churches, Christian missionaries seeking to convert the Greeks took what was already established and fit it to their own narrative. The great god Pan, in a few hundred years, went from a revered guardian of shepherds and hunters to a demon to finally the dark angel himself. The mechanism was deliberate. Early Christian missionaries needed the people they were converting to recognize their devil. The most effective way to make a devil recognizable to a Greek-speaking population was to give him the face of a god they already knew and feared and half-revered. Pan's goat legs, Poseidon's trident, repurposed as a pitchfork, Hades' dark domain, rebranded as hell. Depictions of Satan became more common in the 9th century, where he is shown with cloven hooves, hairy legs, the tail of a goat, pointed ears, a beard, a flat nose, and a set of horns. Pan died as a god sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era. An ancient tradition recorded by Plutarch holds that sailors off the coast of Greece heard a mysterious voice crying out that the great god Pan was dead. The story is probably apocryphal, but his body did not disappear. It was redistributed to the devil. Azazel. The scapegoat, Leviticus 16. The Day of Atonement. The high priest takes 2 goats. One is sacrificed to God. The other is sent alive into the wilderness, to Azazel. The Essenes applied symbolic names to Satan and his agents. Belial, meaning worthless in Hebrew, who will lead the sons of darkness against those of light in the final battle, as described in the war scroll found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1 Enos, a text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated approximately to the 2nd century BCE, Azazel becomes a fully realized fallen angel who taught humanity to make weapons and introduced women to cosmetics, both framed as corrupting gifts. He is bound in a desert pit and covered with rocks until the Day of Judgment. Whether Azazel was originally a pre-Israelite desert deity, a demon, or a place name, the text repurposed him into something specific, a supernatural entity who receives the community's accumulated sin and carries it away into the wilderness. The first scapegoat, the being at the edge of civilization who takes what the community cannot carry. That function, the designated receiver of collective guilt, the entity that exists at the boundary of the known world and absorbs what must be expelled, became one of Satan's core theological roles, the adversary, the accuser, the one who takes the sins and carries them out. The goat sent to Azazel is where the image of the horned devil receiving damned souls was constructed, not in the New Testament, in Leviticus, through a ritual that predates Christianity by centuries. Lucifer. The final mistake. Lucifer is a Latin word meaning morning star, specifically the planet Venus, as it appears before dawn. It is not a name for the devil in the original Hebrew. Isaiah 14:12. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. The passage is a political polemic directed at the king of Babylon, a human ruler being mocked for his hubris in claiming divine status. In the original Hebrew, the phrase is helel ben shahar, shining one, son of the dawn. When Jerome translated the Hebrew scriptures into Latin in the 4th century CE, he knew that the Romans named their morning star, the planet Venus, Lucifer, and translated the passage as such. Lucifer became the most popular name for Satan in the Middle Ages. A translation choice made by one scholar in the 4th century CE, applied to a passage about a Babylonian king, became the primary name for the devil across 1,000 years of Western culture. The name Lucifer, the Lightbringer, the morning star, the fallen angel cast from heaven, is a case of mistaken identity applied to a poetic metaphor and then allowed to calcify into doctrine. It is not the only misreading in this history, but it is the most consequential one. A Hebrew bureaucrat, a Persian co-eternal principle of destruction, a Canaanite sea-serpent with 7 heads, a Greek god of wilderness given to missionaries as raw material, a desert scapegoat ritual from Leviticus. A Latin translation error applied to a Babylonian king. 6 sources, 6 cultures, roughly 1,000 years of accumulation from the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE through the medieval standardization of Satan's image in the 9th century CE. None of these sources were trying to build the same thing. None of them knew what the others were contributing. Cultural exchanges between Zoroastrians and Jews involved adopting and adapting beliefs, not mere imitation. The early Christian missionaries who borrowed Pan's body were not making a theological argument. They were making a practical one. Recognition. The devil you know is recognizable because the people who built him were very good at using what was already there. Every horned red figure in every Halloween store is a palimpsest, a document written over older documents, the original text still visible underneath if you know where to look. The Persian dualism underneath the Christian theology. The Canaanite sea-serpent underneath the dragon of Revelation. The Greek goat god underneath the cloven hooves. The Hebrew court official underneath the prince of darkness. None of these civilizations survived into the modern world in their original form, but their monsters did. They just stopped being credited.